Welcome to Speaking of Authors. I'm Susan Tarnowski, manager of the Edina Art Center. Our series, Speaking of Authors, is designed to tell stories, all of the stories. The story the author tells, the story the author lived, how and why the author writes, and how the readers and the listeners interact with their stories. In this interview, you will hear our host, Barbara Lavallure, photojournalist and memoirist, speaking with author and storyteller Ann Dunn. Ann is an Anishinaabe storyteller, poet, and published author. She knows that stories inform lives, model values, and help community and culture to survive. Her book, Fire in the Village, is a compilation of retold stories and new stories by Ann. This interview is special in two ways. First, we're sharing a virtual interview conducted via Zoom, virtually, with you, a first for Speaking of Authors. Ann Dunn and Barbara Lavallure, secondly, are friends. They have known each other for a very long time, and the ease and the respect of these two friends is evident in this interview. Please enjoy this lovely conversation among friends. Barbara?
Thank you for your introduction, Susan, and welcome, Ann. I am so excited to have you here today on Speaking of Authors, and this is a first for Speaking of Authors, not only because obviously it's the first time that we've had an interview together, at least in this platform, but also this is our first Zoom interview. All of the other ones were done in person, but you live quite a ways away. So I wanted to let the audience know, full disclosure, that I've known Ann Dunn for a long, long time. You were a dear friend of my late sister, Sharon Henneman, and I think she introduced us 20 years ago or even more, probably. So before I start asking you questions about your book, Fire in the Village, which I love, 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 why don't you share a little bit about some of the things you've done, your background, where you were raised, maybe a tale or about being a reporter at the Grand Forks Herald. And I think you were also a licensed practical nurse. Was that in Minneapolis?
No, I got my training down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then I worked briefly at a Indian Health Service hospital on the Cheyenne River Reservation in Eagle Butte, South Dakota. That was a really fun place for me to live and knew a lot of nice young people. I came home and got married and had kids, but then I got into journalism. I went to college and I got into journalism, and I really enjoyed that. I did a lot of small newspapers, and then I finally got a job with the Grand Forks Herald. So I had to move out there for a while. And that was a really, I think that was like one of the most exciting jobs I've ever had. Well, it was pretty exciting to work in the hospital. I don't want to say that wasn't exciting, but every day I went out and met different people and came back to with a good, I thought, a good story. I think I was a very good feature writer. I met a lot of really, they weren't just interesting, but they were incredibly unique.
And were you born or where were you raised, Ann?
Well, I was born on the Red Lake Reservation, and my grandma would always say I was born the winter of the storm. So I didn't know that I had a birth date until I got to school. And they asked me when I was born, and I told them I was born the winter of the great storm, because that's what I'd always been told. And the teacher said, kind of like, well, what's the matter with you? Don't you know when you were born? So I said, well, I was born the winter of the great storm. And I started to wonder what was wrong with her that she didn't know about the storm. But she said I would have to go home and find out when I was born. So I went home and I said, Grandma, when was I born? And she said, you were born the winter of the great storm. So, so we were caught in that. Well, anyway, I finally got it figured out, and the teacher was happy.
Oh, well, that's good, I guess.
I guess.
So today we're going to be talking about your book, Fire in the
Good.
Village, New and Selected Stories. But I also have all of your other books here. So I'm going to show them because I love those too. So when Beaver was very great, Stories to Live By. I think that was your first one. Grandmother's Gifts, Stories from Anishinaabe. Winter Thunder, Retold Tales. And I particularly love this one, Uncombed Hair Poems. So tell us how this book, your latest book, oh, maybe you want to introduce your granddaughter there, but she'll have to have her face come over a little bit.
You can tell her your own name, can't you?
Hi.
Come into the picture. There you are. Oh.
So what's your name?
Niggy Gunsikwe.
Niggy. Well, I'm so glad you could join us. So we're talking with Grandma now. So I'm going to ask Grandma some questions. So don't hide her face, will you? So, Anne, you're a
I don't think I can hold you.
Well, thank you for sharing her with us. You're a well-known Anishinaabe grandmother storyteller. And how does Fire in the Village differ from the other books? Or maybe it doesn't.
Well, it's probably not what you would call a pure collection, because it has retold stories, and then it has stories that I made up for the book, because when the editor asked me if I would put together what he called the like the ultimate book, that I would put together something for him, and he wanted me to have 75 stories, because that was the year I turned 75, and he wanted to celebrate my 75 years. So it's been a while since that was my last book that came out. So he I sent him the 75 stories, and I went through all the other books there and selected different stories that we could put in there. And when I had 75, I found out from him that he was going to reject some of them.
Oh no.
So that meant I had to come up with some different stories. But thankfully, I'd been writing stories. I hadn't quit writing stories just because I hadn't been published for a while. So I had a really good, and I still do have a collection of unpublished short stories. And so I started adding those stories in, and some of those got rejected, but I had so many that I eventually filled the bill.
Wonderful.
And we got 75 stories.
So one of the things that your mother used to say is stories have long legs. What did she mean by that?
Well, I found out that some of the stories that we thought were Ojibwe stories were also being told in other places. And so they have these long legs, and that's also because the storyteller travels too and carries those stories around. So other people pick those stories up and they begin to tell them. And some of the stories actually didn't even originate with us. We did the same thing. We picked up stories from other tellers in other places. And I was we had a Camp Justice renewal as a political thing on the reservation at White Earth, and I was one of the speakers, and I told a certain story, and I saw one of the men in the group, and he was just smiling and got real happy about this story. And I was kind of surprised by his reaction, because I didn't usually get that much reaction to a story, but he was excited and happy about it. And afterwards he came and he told me about that story. He said, that's the same story that they tell in his homeland, which was Nicaragua.
Oh my.
And he said, yeah, but he said, of course, they have different they don't use the same birds. They have different birds, but it's a turtle story. And so they have a turtle story that's very similar to ours.
Wow.
Very.
Wow. So what did your mother and your grandmother pass down to you that you've taken to heart or maybe lived by? And how much of your storytelling was or is influenced by them or other elders for that matter?
Yeah, it's true. Other elders. My grandmother told stories to the family and to me. And a lot of the storytellers didn't really travel around with their stories, and she would be one of them that stayed home. My mom went traveling with her stories, and of course I've carried my stories to many places. But my grandma, she always liked to tell stories that had children in them. So some of the stories I tell that have children were the stories my maternal grandmother gave to me. And then my mother, she liked to tell stories that had animals. She liked animal stories. So I carry both kinds, and I tell both stories. I do like stories with children. I do. But animals, they have their own wisdom too, and we need to acknowledge that. And those stories have really influenced me as well. They teach you about courtesy, how to treat others, and yeah, and give you social ethics. Like one of the primary ethics in our community, a lot of people aren't adhering to them anymore. They got influence from the outside, and so they don't really carry their traditions with them. But one of them is to respect your elders, and that was very important when I was younger. And some people still think it's important, and that's nice. And the other one was learning to share. Sharing was vital, because if we didn't share, somebody was going to go without, and they might suffer because of it. So if we had more than we needed, we gave it to somebody who didn't have enough. So when like we talk about greed or accumulating great wealth, and that would not be a good value. I think it is a value, but it's kind of negative.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, sharing that. Now that you're an elder yourself, what are some of the most important things you're passing down to younger generations, like Nikki, your granddaughter, and other grandchildren, and perhaps the young people that you always seem to be having visitors from relatives and friends? What are some of the most important things that you want to pass down to them?
Well, I certainly want them to be generous. I don't want them to be selfish and greedy. I want them to be respectful and affectionate. I don't want them to be liars, and I don't want them to be lazy. And a lot of the stories we tell actually do address those issues. We have several stories that talk about what happens if you're lazy. So it's sort of like, now, we don't say this is the moral of the story, but you're supposed to gather that idea as the story is told, that it's not a good idea to be a greedy person, a lazy person, a lying person.
I wanted to show the cover once again and give a shout out to your daughter, Annie Humphrey. I really enjoy her illustrations in the book, and I hope the viewers can see those. That's from Keeper of the Hair Bowl, which was kind of a fun story. Are any of your children or grandchildren following in your storytelling footsteps?
Not as far as I know, but that's okay, because they could pick it up. They've all heard the stories, so they could start telling them. Nikki she's what, 7 years old. So she has 8. Whoa, she's getting old. She's 8. So she hasn't heard a lot of the stories, but she's heard some of them. And I know that we don't spend enough time together either. So when we are together, we're often not telling stories. But you almost have to have like a specific story event to get the young people to gather and pay attention. There's so many distractions, so many. They got those phones, and they like to be on those phones, and even like my grown-up grandchildren, they come to visit and they hardly visit at all because they're on that phone, tapping it all the time.
Yes, yes. So I particularly love the animal stories that you tell. It brings out such an incredible imagination, and the animals, of course, in your storytelling are speaking. So they become so real. I love the Chipmunk Story. That is on page 7 of your book. Have you got a copy of your book right there by any chance?
I've got one right here.
Oh, I thought you might. So would you like to either read the story or tell the story of the chipmunk?
Well, I'll tell you, this is this is a retold tale. This is a traditional story that many storytellers tell this. And this is like, if you were gonna try to be a storyteller and you were going to be like an apprentice, this is probably one of the stories that you would learn right from the start, because
Awesome.
it's short and there's nothing really hard about it, and it teaches you to listen and to remember.
Mhm.
The stories are good for that, because we were told that it's important for us to look, to look around us, to listen to those who have good things to tell us, and from all of this we learn. So I've decided those are my 3 L's: look, listen, and learn. So the Chipmunk Story, and they all come from long ago. So they start like that usually, and this one does. Long ago, Creator appointed Porcupine to be the leader of all the forest animals. Soon after he took his position, he called them together for a meeting. When they had all arrived, he stood and asked, "Shall we have night and darkness all the time? Or shall we have day and sunlight all the time?" This was an important question, and much discussion followed. After a long debate, those in favor of darkness appointed Bear to explain their position. "Night is best," Bear sang. "We shall have night. Never will the light fall upon us as we roam our dark world." But Chipmunk, who wished for night to be followed by day, disagreed. Chipmunk sang, "The light will come. We shall have day, but night will separate the days. We shall have day." While Chipmunk sang, the sun began to rise, filling the forest with light. When Bear saw that Chipmunk's song was more powerful than his own, he became angry and tried to stop Chipmunk. The followers of Bear were angry too. They chased Chipmunk, who sang as he ran. Chipmunk managed to escape into a hole just as Bear's huge claws scraped his small back, leaving the marks he still carries today. But because of Chipmunk, night and day have followed each other through the circles of time from that day to this. What I always thought was interesting about that story is that they didn't have enough choices. The porcupine said, "Well, should we have day or should we have night?" So there's not enough choice there. And so then the chipmunk, who's really, really small, came along as the spokesman, and he wasn't saying, "Now we're going to have day because that's what I want." He says it was a compromise, but the bear was angry anyway. He didn't want to compromise. He wanted his own way. And I think when you're big like that, you kind of have the feeling that you deserve to have it your own way.
That was just wonderful, Anne. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, our time is running out. As the viewers can tell, we're not sitting together in a room at the Edina Library, where most of our interviews have been, or all of our interviews have been taken, or have occurred. I am up at La Farm in Otter Tail County, and this is a place you've come often, and you've stayed here a few times throughout
Oh,
the
I
year.
love that farm.
And we have had so many wonderful house concerts here with you and Patty Kakek playing her guitar and singing, and a circle of people gathering around in our living room with drums and just listening to you tell stories. It's been kind of like that, only not quite so close today. But thank you so much for being with us, Ann, Dunn, and Niggy back there in the background, who we see. Thank you for being with us today too, Niggy. And I would say, listen up. Your grandmother has stories to tell. Thanks so much, Ann. And now Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara and Ann. I was struck by the comment Ann made about how her mother always said, stories have long legs. Storytellers travel and their stories are adapted and retold in new settings to new listeners. Ann condenses her belief in the power of storytelling into a simple phrase: look, listen, learn. My mother also believed in the need to tell stories and to listen. This is their legacy. Thank you again, Ann and Barbara. Ann's books are available from Barnes & Noble and Amazon. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Speaking of Authors. Thank you.